I've never been a man who cried easily, but the morning I found the ashes in the fireplace, I got down on my knees on my own living room floor and made a sound I didn't recognize as belonging to me. 6 words. That's all that survived the fire. 6 words, curled black at the edges, clinging to a corner of paper that hadn't quite caught. If anything happens to the stove, that was it. That was all Eleanor had left me. And my own son had burned the rest of it 3 days after we buried her. Welcome back. Pour your coffee, settle in, and get ready, because in these stories, karma always finds the address. Subscribe so you never miss what happens next. My name is Walter Danfield. I'm 62 years old, and for 38 of those years, I ran Danfield Hardware and Supply, a business I built from one delivery van and a folding table of loose nails into 6 stores across 2 counties. I tell you that not to brag, but so you understand what kind of man I was before any of this happened. I was the man who checked the locks twice, who balanced the register to the penny, who never signed anything he hadn't read 3 times. That man doesn't lose things. That man doesn't get fooled. I did both in the same year, and it nearly finished me, but I need to start 5 months before the fireplace, because that's where the real story begins. In a hospital room that smelled like rubbing alcohol, and the particular silence that comes right before, a doctor tells you something he's rehearsed, saying Eleanor had been sick for the better part of a year. We didn't talk about it much outside the house. She wasn't the type to want casseroles and sympathy cards piling up on the porch. But by that spring, we both knew where it was heading. She spent her last good weeks the way she'd spent most of our 41 years together, sitting in her sewing room with the radio low, working a needle through fabric with hands that never once trembled, no matter what the rest of her body was doing. "Walter," she said to me one evening, not looking up from the hem she was stitching, "promise me something. Anything. Don't let Preston talk you into anything for at least a year after I'm gone. Not the house, not the business, not the accounts. A year, Walter. Promise me a full year." I laughed. The way you laugh when your wife says something that sounds like an old woman's superstition. "Preston's our son, Elle. He's not going to talk me into anything." She looked up at me then, and there was something in her face I'd only seen a handful of times in 4 decades of marriage. A kind of grim, tired certainty that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Just promise me," she said. "A year." I promised. I didn't ask why. I've spent every day since wishing I had. Eleanor Danfield died on a Tuesday in October, in the bed we'd shared for 39 years, with my hand in hers, and the last light of the afternoon coming through the curtains she'd sewn herself 20 years earlier. I won't dress up how that felt. There isn't a word big enough. The house went quiet in a way houses only go quiet once, and I understood for the first time in my life what people meant when they said a home has a heartbeat, and I had just watched it stop. Preston flew in from Charlotte the next morning with his wife Vanessa, trailing a rolling suitcase and a face that arranged itself into grief a half-second too late for my liking. I told myself I was imagining it. Grief makes suspicious men out of husbands who've just lost their wives, I thought. I was wrong about that too, but it would take me months to understand how wrong. The funeral was small, the way Eleanor would have wanted it. Neighbors. A few old employees from the store. Roy Fenwick, who'd lived 2 houses down from us for 30 years and spent 26 of them as a sheriff's deputy before he retired, stood beside me at the graveside with his hat in his hands and didn't say a single empty word the entire service. That's Roy. He's never once told me something was going to be okay when he didn't actually believe it. 3 days after we lowered Eleanor into the ground, I came downstairs to the smell of smoke. Preston was crouched at the fireplace in his sock feet, feeding papers into a fire he had no business building in October. I remember standing in the doorway for a long moment before he even noticed me, watching my son burn something with the same careful, methodical motion Eleanor used when she cut fabric along a pattern line. Steady, unhurried, like a man doing a chore he'd done 100 times before. "Preston, what in God's name are you doing?" He startled, but recovered fast. Too fast, I'd think later. "Cleaning out Mom's desk, Dad. There's a lot of old stuff in there. Bank statements from the 80s, grocery lists. You don't need to keep all of it." "You're burning your mother's things 3 days after her funeral?" "I'm helping you, Dad." Somebody has to start sorting through it eventually. I figured I'd save you the pain of doing it yourself. I should have stopped him right there. I should have asked to see what was in his hands before another page went into the flames. Instead, I stood in that doorway feeling exactly the kind of exhausted, grief-numb gratitude that makes a man stop watching his own house. My son is taking care of things, I thought. My son is being good to me. I went and made coffee I didn't drink, and by the time I came back, the fire had burned down to embers, and a curl of scorched paper by the grate. I almost threw that curl of paper away. I don't know what made me pick it up instead. Habit. Maybe 40 years of never leaving a mess for someone else to clean. I unfolded it as carefully as a man handles something he already suspects is going to hurt him, and there it was. Eleanor's handwriting, small and slanted and precise the way it had been since the day I met her. 6 words and then char. If anything happens to the store, storage, story. I turned that fragment over in my hands for an hour that night, sitting alone at the kitchen table with the light off, trying every word that could follow those letters, and none of them made sense, and all of them made my stomach turn to ice at the same time. I called Preston the next morning. "What exactly did you burn yesterday?" "I told you, Dad. Just old paperwork." "Why? Is something wrong?" "I found a piece that didn't burn all the way. It looked like your mother had written something. A letter, maybe." There was a pause on the line, just half a second too long. "Probably just her grocery list, Dad. You know how Mom was. She wrote everything down. I really didn't look that closely. I just wanted to help clear the clutter before it got overwhelming for you." I wanted to believe him. That's the part I still have trouble forgiving myself for. I wanted so badly to believe that my son had simply made a thoughtless, grief-clumsy mistake that I let the question drop for nearly 6 weeks. 6 weeks I will never get back, and that Preston used better than I ever gave him credit for. Grief does strange things to a man's schedule. I went back to the store most days because sitting in that empty house felt like drowning slowly, and work was the only thing that kept my hands busy enough to keep my mind from circling the drain. It was on one of those long, gray afternoons in November that Dinah Okafor, the home health aide who'd looked after Eleanor those final months, stopped by the store to drop off a few things she'd found while cleaning out the hospice equipment from the house. "Mr. Danfield," she said, setting a small cardboard box on the counter, "I wanted to give you these myself instead of leaving them with your son. Eleanor asked me to—" "Asked you to what?" "To make sure they went directly to you. No detours." Dinah had the kind of steady, unhurried way of talking that made you listen harder, not less. She said it more than once, actually. The last few weeks, whenever your son or his wife would come by the house, she'd get this look on her face. Watchful. She asked me once if I thought Preston seemed different lately. Stressed about something. What'd you tell her? I told her it wasn't my place to say. But between you and me, Mr. Danfield, I've been doing this work 11 years. I've seen a lot of families circle a dying woman's house like it's already up for auction. Your son and his wife had a particular way of looking at your wife's jewelry box that I didn't love. I felt something cold settle low in my chest. The same feeling I'd get years later, standing in a room I hadn't been born into yet, hearing things I couldn't unhear. Did she say anything else about being worried? Dinah hesitated. And in that hesitation, I learned to read the specific silence of someone deciding how much of another person's business belonged to them to share. She told me she was writing something down. Said if anything ever happened to her sudden or if certain people got to her things before I did, she wanted me to remind you to check on her sewing. Her sewing. That's what she said. Tell Walter to check on my sewing. I figured it was about finishing a quilt she'd started for your granddaughter. I'm sorry, Mr. Danfield. I should have said something sooner. I didn't think it was urgent. I thanked her, and I meant it. Though it would be another 2 weeks before I understood what she'd actually handed me. Not information, but the first thread of a rope I'd eventually use to hang an empire built on my own grief. I want to tell you I went straight home and tore that house apart, looking for whatever Eleanor had hidden in her sewing. I didn't. Life doesn't work in straight lines, no matter how clean it looks when you're telling the story after the fact. I had a business to run, 4 remaining stores that didn't stop needing me, just because my heart had stopped working right. I had a granddaughter, Lily, 10 years old, who called me every Sunday evening just to tell me about her week. And those calls were the only thing keeping me tethered to anything resembling a normal life. It was Lily, actually, who cracked the next piece open, though she didn't know it at the time. "Grandpa," she said one Sunday, her voice small and careful in the particular way children get when they're repeating something they weren't supposed to hear. "Is Daddy in trouble with money?" "What makes you ask that, sweetheart?" "I heard him and Mommy fighting last night. Daddy said something about a deadline and an audit, and Mommy said something about Grandma's account, and then they saw me in the hallway and stopped talking, and Daddy told me to go to bed." I sat very still in my kitchen, with the phone pressed to my ear, feeling the floor tilt slightly under a house that had felt solid enough 2 minutes earlier. "An audit, huh? I don't know what that means, Grandpa." "It's all right, baby. Grown-up stuff. Don't you worry about it." I told her I loved her, told her to get some sleep, and sat at that kitchen table for a long time after we hung up, turning the word audit over in my mind, the same way I'd turned over that scorched fragment of Eleanor's handwriting 6 weeks earlier. I called Roy the next morning. Some men call a lawyer first. I called the retired deputy who'd lived 2 doors down from me for 30 years and had never once in that time given me advice that turned out wrong. "Walk me through it slow," Roy said, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table with 2 mugs of coffee neither of us drank. "Every piece. Don't skip anything because it seems small. Small is usually where these things start." So I told him. The scorched fragment. Preston's fire 3 days after the funeral. Dinah's warning about the jewelry box, and Eleanor's message about checking on her sewing. Lily's phone call. The word audit hanging in a 10-year-old's mouth, like something she didn't understand but knew was dangerous. Roy didn't say anything for a long moment. He turned his coffee mug in a slow half-circle on the table, the way he used to do. He told me once, when he was building a case in his head and didn't want to speak until the shape of it made sense. "Your son runs Danfield Realty Group now, that right? The subsidiary you set him up with handles closings and escrow for half the developments in this county?" Preston's run it 8 years. Since I stepped back from that side of the business. "You ever look at the books on that side?" "Never had a reason to." "Preston handles it clean, or I always figured he did." Roy nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's already 3 steps ahead of the conversation and deciding how gently to bring you along with him. "Walter, I'm not saying anything for certain yet. I've been wrong before. But a man doesn't usually burn his dead mother's private letters 3 days after her funeral out of the goodness of his heart. And a man doesn't usually fight with his wife about audits and his mother's accounts unless there's a reason those 2 things are connected in his head. You think Preston's in trouble?" "I think," Roy said carefully, "that your wife knew something before she died. I think she was scared enough of what would happen to that knowledge that she told her hospice aide, in code, to make sure it reached you no matter what. And I think your son found out she'd written it down, and instead of grieving his mother like the rest of this family, he spent his energy making sure that letter never made it into your hands." I sat with that for a long time. Outside, the last of the fall leaves were coming down off the maple Eleanor had planted the year Preston was born, and I remember thinking, with a kind of slow, sick clarity, that I had spent 6 weeks grieving a woman, while the answer to what killed her peace of mind in her final months was sitting 3 doors down the hall from me, the whole time. Hidden somewhere, I hadn't thought to look because I'd raised the man I trusted least in this story to believe I'd never think to check. "Where do I even start, Roy?" "You start," he said, "with her sewing. Dinah gave you the answer weeks ago. You just weren't ready to hear it yet." That night, I went up to the room Eleanor had used for 40 years, the Good North Light, the old Singer machine, the shelves of folded fabric, organized by color the way some men organize tools by size. I went through drawers I'd never opened in my life, spools of thread, patterns cut from butcher paper, yellowed with age, a tin of buttons that rattled like loose teeth when I lifted it, and then at the back of the closet, on the hook where it had hung, for as long as I could remember, I found her good wool coat. Navy blue, a little worn at the cuffs, the one she wore every single Sunday to church, for as long as I'd known her, rain or shine, hot or cold. I remembered suddenly and with a force that nearly buckled my knees, something she'd said to me not 2 weeks before she died, so quietly I'd almost missed it over the sound of the television. Walter, whatever happens, don't let anyone give away my blue coat. I'd thought she meant sentiment. I'd thought she meant it the way people mean those things at the end, holding on to small objects, because the big ones, a life, a marriage, a body that's failing, have already slipped past holding on to. I was wrong. She hadn't meant sentiment at all. I lifted that coat off the hook with hands that weren't quite steady, and I ran my fingers along the hem the way I'd watched her run a needle along fabric 10,000 times over 41 years of marriage, and somewhere past the lining, just below the left inside pocket, my fingers caught on a ridge of stitching that didn't belong there. Small, careful, hand-sewn stitches in a thread that almost matched the lining, but not quite. Close enough to hide from anyone who wasn't looking, and different enough that a man who'd watched his wife sew for 4 decades would know in an instant that something had been placed inside on purpose. I stood there in that closet with my dead wife's coat in my hands, and for the first time since the funeral, I didn't cry. I felt something colder than grief settle into my chest, something with edges, something that would take the better part of a year to fully sharpen. I didn't cut the stitches open that night. I want you to understand that, because it matters for what comes later. I sat on that closet floor for nearly an hour with the coat across my lap, running my thumb along that ridge of hidden thread, and I thought about my son crouched at the fireplace with a fire he had no business building, and I thought about Dinah's careful warning, and I thought about my granddaughter's small, confused voice saying the word audit, like it was something that had crawled into her house uninvited, and I thought, whatever is sewn into this coat, Eleanor didn't put it there for me to find in a hurry. She put it there because she knew exactly who would come looking for her words, and exactly how long it might take before the right person went looking for the coat instead. I didn't know it yet, sitting on that closet floor with my thumb pressed against 41 years of my wife's careful, deliberate love, but I was about to learn that the woman I'd been married to had spent the last months of her life building the only weapon our son could never think to burn. I didn't cut into that lining until the next morning, and even then, I made myself wait until the house was fully light, like some part of me needed the sun up before I could face whatever Eleanor had trusted only to thread in silence. I sat at her sewing table, in her chair, using her own small seam ripper from the tin of notions she'd kept for 40 years, and I worked the stitches loose one at a time, the way she would have wanted it done. Not torn, not rushed. Undone with the same care it had taken to sew shut. Inside, folded into a square no bigger than a playing card, was a single sheet of her stationery, the pale blue kind she'd used for Christmas cards since before Preston was born. 3 pages, folded down small enough to hide, written in the tight, careful hand of a woman who knew she was running out of time to say something, and had decided to say all of it anyway. Walter, if you're reading this, it means the year I asked you to wait didn't happen the way I hoped, and someone got to my desk before you had reason to check my coat. I'm sorry for the riddle of it. I didn't know another way to protect this that Preston couldn't undo in an afternoon. I found out in March. I wasn't snooping. Not really. I was looking for our old tax returns from '09 in the filing cabinet in the den, the one Preston uses when he stays over, and I found a folder that didn't belong there. Client escrow statements from Danfield Realty Group. 6 of them, Walter, going back almost 3 years, each one short by an amount that made my hands shake reading it, not by a little, by tens of thousands of dollars each. The Hargrove closing, the Whitfield subdivision deposit. Money that belonged to people who trusted our name, moved out of the accounts that were supposed to hold it safe and never fully replaced. I confronted him. I know you'll be angry I did that without you, but you were already so tired from the store, and I thought, foolishly, I see now, that I could handle our son alone, mother to son, the way I always used to when he was small and had done something he was ashamed of. He cried, Walter. He actually cried and told me he'd gotten into debt through some investment Vanessa's brother talked him into, something that went bad fast, And he'd only meant to borrow the escrow money for a few weeks until it turned around. And it never turned around. And now there's an audit scheduled for the fall because one of the title companies flagged a discrepancy on the Whitfield file. He begged me not to tell you. Said it would kill you to know. Said he'd fix it before you ever had to find out. Said if I told you, it would destroy the business you spent your whole life building. I believed some of that. I think some of it was even true. But I also watched my son look at me and calculate, in real time, exactly how much of the truth he needed to give me to keep me quiet, and that is not a thing a mother forgets, seeing on her child's face. I told him I would give him until the end of the year to make it right on his own, pay it back, come clean to the title insurers, whatever it took, so long as he did it himself, honestly, and told you the truth before an auditor did it for him. I didn't tell him I'd already started keeping copies. I photographed every page of that escrow file with my own phone the same week I found it, and I mailed the memory card to my sister Ruth in Asheville with a letter asking her to hold it and not open it unless I called and told her to, or unless something happened to me. Ruth doesn't know what's on it. She's never been the type to pry. But she will give it to you the moment you call her and say the word sewing, because that's the word I told her to wait for. I don't know if I'll live long enough to see whether Preston kept his word. I suspect in the part of myself I trust most that he won't. I think he'll wait for me to die and hope the whole thing dies quietly with me. I think he may already be planning what he'll say to you, about the house, about the stores, about whether you're still sharp enough to be trusted with your own decisions once I'm not there to back you up in a room. I have watched Vanessa look at this house the way a person looks at something they've already decided belongs to them. I could be wrong about all of it. I hope with everything left in me that I am wrong. But if I'm not, if you're reading this because the year passed and something worse than my dying happened first, then I need you to do 3 things. Call Ruth and say, sewing. Ask Dinah what I told her, because I made her a promise keeper too, in case Preston ever thought to search this coat before you did. And Walter, please, for the love of God, don't sign anything Preston or Vanessa puts in front of you without showing it to Roy Fenwick first. I know how tired grief makes a person. I know how easy it is to sign what your child asks you to sign because some part of you still believes, 40 years in, that your children would never use your grief against you. I loved being your wife more than I loved anything else I ever did in this life. Walter, including raising that boy. God help me for saying it. But it's the truth on the page in front of you, and I am done protecting people who don't deserve protecting to find the truth. Then find your peace. In that order, not the other way around. All my love, always. Eleanor read that letter 4 times before I could stand up from the table. Then I called Ruth. She picked up on the second ring, and when I said the word sewing, there was a silence on the line, so long I thought the call had dropped. And then I heard her start to cry, the particular sound of someone who has been carrying a secret for months without knowing its full shape, waiting for permission to finally set it down. She made me promise, Walter. She said if you ever called and said that word, I wasn't to ask questions, just to overnight it to you the same day. I've had that little memory card in my jewelry box since March. I didn't even know what was on it. I just knew my sister asked me to keep something safe, and I've never once in my life said no to Eleanor when she used that particular tone of voice. The package arrived 2 days later. 6 escrow statements, photographed page by page in Eleanor's own hand, holding the phone steady, timestamps proving she'd found and documented every one of them back in March. 5 full months before she died. 7 months before Preston stood at my fireplace burning the only written record he thought existed of what he'd done. I called Roy that same afternoon and laid everything on the table between us. The letter, the photographs, the dates that lined up like dominoes falling in the direction Eleanor had quietly, carefully arranged them to fall. This isn't a family disagreement anymore, Walter, Roy said, and for the first time since Eleanor's funeral, I saw something in his face that looked almost like relief. The particular satisfaction of a man who spent 26 years chasing shapes in fog finally getting to look at something solid. This is embezzlement. Client trust fund theft. If I'm reading these statements right, and depending on how deep it goes, That's the kind of thing that doesn't stay a family matter no matter how much money changes hands to keep it quiet. I need to know how deep it goes before I do anything. Then you need Marisol Ochoa. She's a forensics accountant, does contract work for two of the district attorneys in this part of the state. Retired early from the bureau to go independent. I've sent her two other cases over the years. She doesn't miss things, and she doesn't scare. I met Marisol 3 days later in a small rented office above the hardware store's original location downtown. The first Danfield Hardware, the one I'd started in, the one I still owned, even though I hadn't run daily operations out of it in 20 years. It felt right, somehow building the case that would decide my son's future in the same building, where I'd built everything he stood to inherit. 6 statements is just what your wife happened to find in one folder. Marisol told me after her first week going through everything Eleanor's photographs had documented, plus what Marisol herself was able to pull from public filings and title company records. If she found 6 by accident, there's almost certainly more. Escrow theft like this doesn't stay contained to a handful of files. Once someone starts borrowing from funds they're supposed to be holding safe, they don't usually stop until they're caught, or the money runs dry. How much are we talking total, if it's as bad as you think? Marisol didn't flinch delivering it the way Adeline never had, the way people who deal in large numbers professionally learn not to flinch at all. Conservatively, based on what I've traced so far across 11 separate closings over 3 years, somewhere north of $400,000. And Walter, I need you to understand something about the timeline. The audit your granddaughter overheard him mention isn't some routine internal check. I found the notice. The state's Real Estate Commission flagged an irregularity on the Whitfield subdivision filing back in September, right around the time your wife passed. Preston has known for at least 2 months that regulators were closing in, which means every single thing he's done since your wife's funeral, burning that letter, and I'd bet you my license there's more coming, has been about buying himself time before that audit lands, not about grief. I sat with that in the quiet of that upstairs office for a long time, looking out the window at the street, where I'd once swept the sidewalk myself. Before opening on Saturday mornings, my son trailing behind me with a broom half his size, laughing at nothing the way small children do. There's something else, Marisol said carefully. You should be prepared for this before it happens because I think it's coming. Men in Preston's position, once they realize the walls are closing in on the fraud side, they often try to get ahead of it by controlling the one thing that could stop them from accessing more money to cover the gap. In your case, that's you, your assets, your signature. I'd watch very closely for any conversation about your competency, your memory, your ability to manage your own finances. It's a common move. Make the parent look unstable enough that a court hands control to the child before anyone starts asking harder questions about where the money's actually going. I laughed, short and bitter. The same laugh I'd give 100 more times before this was over. Preston already tried that angle 2 weeks ago. Called me twice in one day, asking if I remembered paying the property taxes on the Elm Street store, like he was testing me. Vanessa mentioned, real casual over dinner, that a lot of men my age start having trouble keeping track of paperwork after losing a spouse. I thought they were just being thoughtful. They weren't being thoughtful, Walter. They were building a file. I didn't know it yet, sitting in that office above the store where I'd once taught a small boy to sweep a sidewalk. But Marisol's warning was about to prove exactly right. Faster and colder than either of us expected. Preston called 2 days later, his voice warm in the exact register he used to use as a teenager right before asking for the car keys. Dad, Vanessa, and I were talking, and we think it might help to have Dr. Amundsen do a quick wellness check. Just routine, given everything you've been through this year. Losing Mom, running the stores solo, the stress of it all. We just want to make sure you're taking care of yourself. I'm taking care of myself. Fine, Preston. I know, Dad. I know. It's just Vanessa's cousin is an elder law attorney, and she mentioned that after a spouse passes, it's smart to get some paperwork in order early. Power of attorney, just as a precaution, so if anything ever happens suddenly, The business and the house wouldn't get tied up in some long legal mess. You wouldn't lose control of anything. It's just a safety net. A safety net. My son, $400,000 deep in stolen client funds with a state audit closing in, was asking me to hand him legal control over every account I owned, dressed up in the exact soft, caring language Eleanor had warned me about in a letter I'd found sewn into her coat, because she knew better than I did exactly what this conversation would sound like when it finally came. "Let me think about it," I said, and I meant it to buy time, not because any part of me was tempted. "Of course, Dad. No rush at all. Just sooner's probably better, honestly, in case anything happens. You know how these health things can turn fast at our age." Our age. Preston was 36 years old. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the chair where Eleanor used to sit across from me every single evening for 39 years, and I thought about a year-long promise I'd already broken without meaning to, and a coat I'd almost let get thrown out with the rest of her things during one of those long gray weeks when I couldn't bring myself to sort through a single drawer. I called Marisol back that same night. "How long until you have enough documented to take this somewhere official?" "2 more weeks, maybe 3. If I can get bank records subpoenaed through the DA's office instead of chasing everything independently." "Why?" "Because my son just asked me to sign over power of attorney as a, quote, safety net. I think the clock just started running a lot faster than either of us expected." There was a pause on the line, and when Marisol spoke again, her voice had the particular steadiness of someone who has watched this exact play run before and knows precisely how it ends when the timing goes wrong. "Then we move faster too, Walter. And in the meantime, do not sign one single piece of paper your son or his wife hands you. Not a birthday card, not a grocery list, nothing. If he pushes on the power of attorney again, tell him your own lawyer wants to review it first. Every day you stall him without an outright refusal is a day we get to keep building." I didn't know it yet. Hanging up that phone in a kitchen, gone quiet the way it had been quiet every night since October, but I was about to spend the better part of a month becoming the kind of patient, careful liar I'd never once had to be in 38 years of running an honest business. And every lie I told my son over those 4 weeks was going to be in service of the one truth Eleanor had trusted a needle and thread to keep safe for me, longer than she'd trusted her own son to hear it out loud. For the next 3 weeks, I became someone I'd never had to be in 38 years of running an honest business. I learned to smile at my son over Sunday dinner while a forensic accountant 3 towns over quietly built the case that would end his career. I learned to say my lawyer's reviewing it in a voice that sounded tired instead of suspicious, stretching 1 week into 3 while Preston's patience thinned by degrees I could watch happening in real time, like weather moving across a field. "Dad, it's just a form," he said the 3rd time he brought it up, standing in my kitchen with the power of attorney papers in a manila folder, Vanessa hovering by the counter with the specific bright, watchful smile of someone counting down days on a calendar only she could see. "Roy's not a lawyer. Why does he need to see it before your own lawyer does?" "Roy's got good instincts, Preston. Humor an old man." "You're not old, Dad." That's exactly the kind of talk that worries me. I almost laughed in his face. Instead, I poured him a cup of coffee he didn't ask for and asked about Lily's school play, and watched my son's jaw tighten with the particular frustration of a man running out of runway and unable to say why out loud. Marisol called me on a Thursday morning in early December with a voice I hadn't heard from her before. Fast, focused, the sound of a professional watching a case click fully into place. "I got the subpoenaed bank records back this morning, Walter. It's worse than 400,000. It's closer to 620. Once you include 2 closings from 18 months ago I hadn't found yet. And there's something else. The shell arrangement he used to move the money isn't sophisticated, which tells me he never expected anyone competent to look. He funneled a chunk of it through a company called Ridgeline Capital Partners, which on paper is owned by Vanessa's brother, the same one who talked him into the original bad investment your wife's letter mentioned. Except Ridgeline Capital Partners doesn't file taxes, doesn't have an office, and doesn't exist anywhere except on the incorporation paperwork. Preston filed himself from his own office computer 11 months ago. So it was never really an investment gone bad. I don't think it ever was, Walter. I think your son needed a story simple enough to tell his dying mother that would buy him her silence for a few months. And a bad investment was easier to say out loud than the truth, which is that he'd been quietly siphoning client escrow money to cover his own lifestyle and his own gambling debts for years before your wife ever opened that filing cabinet. I sat with that for a long moment in the same upstairs office where I'd once taught a small boy to sweep a sidewalk. What happens now? Now the district attorney's office wants to talk to you directly. And Walter, there's a company holiday dinner scheduled for Danfield Realty Group next Friday, isn't there? The one where Preston presents the year-end numbers to the investor group and the title company partners? Every year since he took it over. Same banquet room at the Fairview Hotel. The DA's investigator asked me to ask you something. Would you be willing to attend? Not to say anything yourself, necessarily, just to be present when certain information becomes impossible for Preston to keep contained any longer. Sometimes the most effective moment to present evidence like this isn't in a courtroom. It's in the room full of the exact people whose trust was violated, while the person responsible is still standing at a podium telling them everything is fine. I thought about Eleanor, sitting at her sewing table with a needle in her hand, hiding the truth in the one place she knew our son would never think to look, because looking there would have meant admitting, even to himself, that his own mother no longer trusted him with her words. I thought about a year-long promise I'd broken by necessity, and a coat that had waited patiently in a closet for 8 weeks to be believed. I'll be there, I said. The Fairview's banquet room was full the following Friday. Investors, title company executives, 2 junior associates from Preston's office, and Vanessa seated at the head table in a green dress that had clearly been bought for the occasion, smiling the bright, brittle smile of a woman who had spent the last 2 months believing her husband's carefully managed version of events. Preston stood at the podium under warm gold light, working through a slideshow of year-end numbers that I now understood. Watching them projected onto the wall were fictions built on top of fictions, dressed up in the same confident, easy delivery he'd used his whole life to get people to stop asking questions. And closing volume up 11% year over year, which puts Danfield Realty Group in an incredibly strong position heading into Preston. I stood up from my chair near the back of the room, and I felt every head in that banquet hall turn toward me at once, the particular silence that falls over a crowd when something has clearly gone off its expected rails. I think these good people deserve to see the real numbers before you finish that sentence. My son's face did something I will remember for the rest of my life. A full, visible collapse of composure, there and gone in under 2 seconds, replaced almost instantly by the practiced warmth he'd been using on me for 2 months straight. Dad, this isn't really the venue for. It's exactly the venue, I said, and nodded to Marisol, who stood near the projector with her laptop already open, exactly as we'd planned it 3 days earlier in an office above a hardware store neither Preston nor Vanessa had thought to look inside in years. The screen behind Preston changed. 6 escrow statements, side by side with the photographs Eleanor had taken with her own trembling hands back in March, time-stamped and dated 7 months before her son ever crouched at a fireplace, burning what he thought was the only proof left in the world. For those of you who don't know, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected it to, my late wife, Eleanor Danfield, discovered these discrepancies in March of this year. Client escrow funds redirected out of protected accounts and never fully replaced. 11 separate closings over the last 3 years. Total shortfall, as of this week's bank records, just over $620,000. A murmur went through the room like wind moving through wheat. One of the title company partners, a heavy-set man near the front I recognized vaguely from prior years, half rose from his seat. That's a serious accusation, Walter. Do you have... I have my wife's own photographs of the original escrow statements, dated and time-stamped 5 months before her death. I have 3 years of bank records subpoenaed through the district attorney's office this week. And I have a shell company called Ridgeline Capital Partners, incorporated by my son from his own office computer 11 months ago, that exists on paper and nowhere else. Used to move a substantial portion of that $620,000 somewhere. It could never be traced back to a legitimate closing. This is a fabrication, Preston said, but his voice had lost the podium warmth entirely now, gone thin and fast in a way I'd never heard from my son in 36 years of knowing him. Dad's been under enormous stress since Mom passed. This is grief talking, not Miss Ochoa, I said. Would you like to walk the room through the incorporation filing? Or would Preston prefer to explain to the district attorney's investigator sitting at table 6 why his signature appears on documents dated back to a period he's telling this room he had, quote, nothing to do with? The silence that followed was different from the first silence. The first had been shock. This one was recognition. The particular sound of a room full of people who trust their money to a name realizing, all at once, that the story they'd been told about that name was a story built to protect one man, not any of them. An older woman near the front, a title company executive named Constance Furr, who I knew had known Preston since he was a boy stocking shelves at the original hardware store, spoke into that silence in a voice gone tight with fury. Preston, is this true? My son didn't answer. He stood at that podium, with his year-end slides frozen behind him, his wife's face going the particular gray-white color of a person watching the floor disappear beneath a life they'd assumed was solid. And for the first time since I'd found that scorched fragment of Eleanor's handwriting in a cold fireplace, I felt something in my chest that wasn't grief and wasn't rage either. It was closer to relief. The relief of a man watching a truth his wife had died protecting finally arrive exactly where she'd always intended it to land, in a room full of people who couldn't be talked out of hearing it. Everything after that moved fast, the way these things do once the first domino finally falls after months of careful, patient pressure. The district attorney's investigator, who'd been sitting quietly at table 6 the entire evening, approached Preston before he'd even made it out of the banquet room. Danfield Realty Group's operating license was suspended within a week, pending a full state audit. Preston was charged with theft by conversion and securities fraud 11 days before Christmas, and released on bond with a court date set for the following spring. I want to tell you I felt triumphant watching all of it unfold. I didn't. I felt the particular hollow exhaustion of a man who has just watched his own child confirm, in front of an entire room, everything his dead wife spent her last strength trying to protect him from believing. I drove home from the Fairview alone that night, past the hardware store where I'd taught a small boy to sweep a sidewalk, and I sat in my driveway for a long time before I could make myself go inside. Vanessa left him within the month the divorce papers filed before Preston's court date was even set, taking Lily with her back to her own mother's house 2 towns over. She called me once in January, her voice careful and small in a way I'd never heard from her before. I didn't know, Walter, about any of it. I want you to believe that. I believe you didn't know the details, I said. I'm less sure you didn't know something was wrong and chose not to ask. She didn't argue with that, which told me most of what I needed to know. Preston called me exactly once from the county lockup during the 3 days he spent there before his family posted bond, and I let it go to voicemail, and I listened to it twice before I could bring myself to delete it. Dad, I know you probably hate me right now. I know I don't deserve you picking up. But Mom's letter, did she say anything about me? Anything at all that wasn't about the money? I sat with that voicemail a long time before I answered it, and when I finally did call him back, weeks later, it was the district attorney's office I spoke with about restitution terms, not my son directly. Some conversations I'd learned by then only mean something once the person having them has stopped trying to manage what you're allowed to hear. The case against Preston settled that spring rather than going to trial. Restitution of the full $620,000, most of it recovered once the state froze Ridgeline Capital Partners' remaining assets. A suspended sentence contingent on 3 years of supervised probation and the permanent surrender of his real estate license. It wasn't the harshest outcome Marisol thought the evidence could have supported. It was, I came to believe, close enough to just. I used what remained of my own savings, along with the recovered restitution funds legally owed to Eleanor's estate, to set up the Eleanor Danfield Legacy Fund, a scholarship through the county school district for kids studying accounting, finance, and small business law, the exact fields. I told the first graduating class at the award ceremony that spring. My wife had never formally studied a day in her life, but understood better in the end than anyone with a diploma ever taught me to. Preston reached out again in the fall, nearly a year after that banquet room, this time in person, standing on my porch in a coat too thin for the weather, asking not for money or forgiveness outright, but for something smaller and, I think, more honest. The chance to see Lily on weekends I could supervise, and to slowly, through nothing but consistent, repeated, unglamorous action, earn back some fraction of the trust he'd spent 36 years building and 11 months burning to the ground. I didn't say yes right away. I told him what Eleanor's letter had told me to remember above everything else, that finding the truth and finding peace were two separate jobs, done in order, not traded for each other out of exhaustion. It took the better part of another year of him showing up when he said he would, calling when he said he would, and never once asking me for anything beyond the next visit, before I let him back into a house he'd once tried to talk me out of. Lily is 12 now. She still calls me every Sunday evening. Last month, helping me fold laundry in the kitchen, where her grandmother used to sit across from me every single night for 39 years, she picked up Eleanor's old sewing tin from where I keep it on the counter, turning it over in her small hands, and asked me, without any particular weight to the question, why I kept an empty tin of buttons on display, like it was something valuable. Because your grandmother taught me something with that tin. I didn't understand until it was almost too late, sweetheart, I told her. She taught me that the truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just waits, quiet and patient, sewn into the one place nobody thought to look, for exactly the person who loves you enough to go looking. Lily thought about that for a moment. The particular serious thinking of a child working something important all the way through before she speaks it out loud. That's kind of like Grandma's whole life, huh? She didn't yell about anything. She just fixed things quietly, with thread, so nobody even noticed until it mattered. I didn't trust my voice to answer her right away. I just nodded, and pulled my granddaughter into a hug in the kitchen, where my wife's love had waited patiently in a coat closet for 2 months to save the only family either of us had left worth saving. 33 people share the rarest blood type on this earth, or so I once heard somewhere, in some other story about some other man's inheritance. I don't know how many people in this world share what Eleanor and I had, a marriage built on 41 years of careful, unglamorous devotion, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that sews its most important truths into the lining of an old blue coat and waits, without bitterness, for the person it loves to finally come looking. I only know I got the last one, and I intend to spend whatever years I have left making sure it was worth exactly what it cost her to protect.